In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. We Americans have a strange and complicated relationship with monarchy. On the one hand, we cherish our liberation from the tyranny of King George III, and we celebrate that every July 4th. On the other hand, whenever British royalty visit the United States, people line the streets, excited to catch a glimpse of them. Back in 2007, when the Jamestown settlement was celebrating its 400th anniversary, Queen Elizabeth II came to Williamsburg, and there were throngs of people lining the streets. Many of them had brought their corgis. It's true. I didn't go because I don't like big crowds of people unless they're in this building. But I saw it on television, and I thought, how far we've come, because Yorktown's just down the road where we knocked off King George III not too long ago. And I won't even mention the profusion of grief that so many people felt when Princess Diana died, or the curiosity we have around whether or not Elizabeth will live long enough to spite her son Charles so one of her dashing grandchildren can take the throne instead. So, as we gather this day to celebrate Christ the King, we've got this ambivalence. We feel repelled, but at the same time kind of attracted to the concept of monarchy. Now, our initial tendency, I think, is to resist the idea that Jesus is our King, because we prefer to think of Jesus as our friend. And since few, if any of us, consort with royalty, we have trouble thinking of our buddy Jesus as Your Majesty. And after all, aren't we taught that Jesus humbled himself, coming down to earth in human form, suffering torture and death on a cross? Such humiliation is foreign to our understanding of kingship. And we don't want Jesus high up on a throne because we're afraid that if we put him high on a throne, we might not be able to reach him. We want what our ancestors had. During Jesus' life here on earth, he was very accessible, especially to the people who had been thrust to the margins of society. People could come to Jesus for help with their problems. But kings aren't like that. They're wrapped up in a little bubble. Only certain people get to see the king. So how could Jesus be a king? Of course, there are times when we do want a king, or at least somebody who can set everything straight. As much as we pride ourselves on resisting authority, we often rely upon powerful people to simplify complexity and to provide assurance and to reduce risk. We constantly appeal to God's authority to protect and heal us, to guide and guard us, and we recognize God's sovereignty as creator of all that exists, as the sole source of life and love and light, the fount of our salvation. Now, how God operates sometimes mystifies us, but there is little doubt that God is active, working out his purposes, striving to orchestrate order out of chaos, so that all people may know peace. I think part of our ambivalence when it comes to Jesus as King arrives from the mistaken connections we draw between Jesus and the sort of higher-ups that we're accustomed to seeing from afar or reading about in history books. When it comes to describing or comprehending who God is and how God operates, we need to be careful to avoid the tendency to apply human analogies too literally. In a way, we suffer from the same problem that Pontius Pilate did. He could not figure out what it meant for Jesus to be a king, because Jesus did not behave like any king Pilate had ever heard of. A king, in Pilate's mind, deployed troops to defend himself and his interests. And Jesus didn't do that. because as the man said, my kingdom is not from this world. None of that really computed for Pilate. What we have to remember is that God transcends the imperfections of mortal kingship, so that Jesus can be both close by us, while at the same time acting at a whole different level that's way beyond us. Sometimes Jesus may appear capricious, making choices we don't like for reasons we cannot understand. But Jesus remains available to receive our petitions. Jesus is always generous in responding to our needs in ways that are best for us, even though we may not readily perceive the wisdom in how Jesus chooses to answer our prayers. And unlike the monarchies of King George III or Queen Elizabeth II, or the most common of all monarchies, the one known as me, myself, and I the first, the kingship of Jesus suffers no limitations, which is wonderful news for us. The awareness that God is really in charge offers a sense of security that is unsurpassed. Why bother to scrutinize and agonize over the choices made by a God who has made it clear that He chooses us, that He has chosen us from before the beginning of time and will keep on choosing us, no matter what, forever? Why question the power of a king who has conquered not armies or nations, but death itself, and promises us the very same victory? Why resist obeying a king who has liberated us from the most destructive force imaginable, sin? Now, the kingship of Christ may cramp our style a bit. The idea of reverence before God is growing increasingly dim as people surrender to a highly emotional, bordering on sentimental way of relating to God. Now, there's nothing wrong with engaging with how we feel when we seek out and find God. But the exuberance that seems increasingly so essential to some may mask a certain shallowness of devotion that can distract people from the true awe elicited when we encounter the holy. If we forget that Christ is King, our prayers could very well sink into a tone that resembles impatient calls to an inattentive waiter. For some, the temptation of self-congratulation and the assumption of superiority overcomes. Like when we ignore the fact that we may be citizens of a great nation, but that our true core identity resides in being subjects of a much greater realm that shows no preference for flag or anthem. But if we bother to remember and believe and embrace the truth of Christ the King, then we will receive blessing. The kingship of Christ gives us another way to understand our God, a God who ultimately exceeds our intellectual and intuitive capacities. And when we remember that God's monarchy is exercised without the limitations and imperfections of those who have been so oppressive and feeble here on earth, we recognize that our concern stems from drawing too close of a parallel between the pale imitations of mere mortals and our God who transcends them all. So long live Christ the King, and all creatures hail him, who was and is to come, the mighty one, champion of weak and strong, the ruler who serves, the humble yet glorious ancient one, who came to dwell among us, that we might live and triumph through him.